President el-Sisi expresses Egypt's strong opposition to Israel's escalation against Iran. Trump says the attacks aimed at crippling Tehran's uranium enrichment capabilities. And Iran's foreign minister condemns the U.S. bombing of Iranian nuclear sites. Good afternoon. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has expressed his country's strong opposition to Israel's escalation against Iran, which threatens Middle Eastern stability amid ongoing crises. That came during his call with Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, where el-Sisi stressed the urgent need for a ceasefire and negotiations for a sustainable solution, emphasizing that military solutions are unviable. Pezeshkian thanked President el-Sisi for Egypt's wise stance in promoting regional stability and shared views on a fair resolution for Palestine. Egypt has expressed deep concern over recent developments in Iran, condemning the escalating tensions that threaten regional and international peace. In a statement by the Foreign Ministry, Egypt reiterated its rejection of any violations of the UN Charter and international law, emphasizing the need to respect state sovereignty. Egypt warned against further chaos and tension, advocating for political solutions and diplomatic negotiations as the only path to a lasting resolution, while calling for restraint and dialogue to protect civilian lives. U.S. President Donald Trump announced that the United States had conducted strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities aimed at crippling Tehran's uranium enrichment capabilities and halting nuclear threats. During a White House press conference, he stated that the nuclear sites were completely destroyed and warned that future attacks would be much larger unless peace is achieved. Trump asserted collaboration with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, emphasizing U.S. responsibility for Israel's protection. And during a press conference, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has stated that U.S. President Donald Trump emphasized that Iran must not acquire nuclear weapons. He claimed that the Iranian nuclear ambitions have been eliminated and described the bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities as a bold move by Trump. Hegseth also insisted that the strikes did not target civilians and warned that the U.S. would respond decisively to any threats to its interests or people.
For the entirety of his time in office, President Trump has...
And the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Air Force General Dan Kane, has announced that 3 Iranian nuclear sites were bombed last night. He stated that the attacks successfully destroyed Iran's nuclear infrastructure and were carried out under a highly classified plan. Kane added that the Central Command executed the strike orders on the orders of U.S. President Donald Trump, with American submarines participating in 12 attacks on Isfahan, targeting the weakening of Iran's nuclear weapons and infrastructure.
Bombers launched from the continental United States.
Meanwhile, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has condemned the U.S. strike on Iranian nuclear sites as an act of aggression, asserting that Washington intervened only after Israel's failure to respond to Iran's military actions. He characterized the U.S. as the primary instigator of Israeli hostility towards Iran, noting that the U.S. initially tried to hide its involvement but had to act when Israel could not manage the situation. And Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has condemned the U.S. bombing of Iranian nuclear sites as an outrageous and unprecedented violation of the UN Charter and international law. He asserted that the warmongering United States administration is entirely responsible for the dangerous repercussions of its actions. Araghchi reaffirmed Iran's commitment to defending its territory, against both the United States and Israel during a press conference in Istanbul. Iran's top nuclear safety official has assured citizens that no radiation had leaked following the US airstrikes on 3 nuclear facilities. Head of Iran's Nuclear Safety Center, Mohammad Reza Kardan, said preemptive safety measures had worked effectively. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed it had detected no rise in off-site radiation levels following the attack, which targeted, among others, the Fordo nuclear site. Iran has requested an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council and urged it to condemn the United States strikes on its nuclear facilities. In a letter, Iran's permanent representative to the United Nations, Amir Saeed Arivani, called the US attack a grave threat against regional and international peace and security. He added the strikes violate the UN Charter and the International Non-Proliferation Treaty. He said an emergency meeting is needed to examine this unlawful act, adopt necessary measures to condemn it, and ensure that those responsible will not be left unpunished. Now, for more on this, we cross over to our newsroom where Mona is there. Mona.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. And for further analysis, we're joined from Cairo by journalist and researcher Mr. Ihab Omar. Good afternoon to you and welcome to Qnews. Let me start by asking you about the just cause of the U.S. to strike the Iranian nuclear facilities and how legal were these strikes were.
Thanks to you and your dear viewers, and thanks for having me. The main cause of these strikes is that has a red line for Iran, and such a red line for all the world's countries in the idea of the possession of nuclear weapons. According to the U.S. calculus itself, the U.S. did not recognize the report of the IAEA or any other entities that could provide a report with this regard. Therefore, the U.S., since the start or the beginning of the Israeli-Iranian strike, or even since the October 7th, 2023, between Gaza and Israel, there was an American desire to strike Iran and targeting the Iranian nuclear facilities to disrupt its thickness of Iranian nuclear programs. Certainly, there are international rules under the international law that ban such ongoing strikes, but the war itself, since 3 years in the Middle East, by all its details, against the international law, and even the current engagement between Iran and Israel under against the international law. So it is basically for the idea of the and the Israeli strikes against the international law. And there is no legislation to give the right for U.S. to target Iranian air by missiles against the nuclear facilities. Based on the IAEA, such facilities, some of them are used for peaceful energy purposes. Therefore, legally, the U.S. is actually condemned, but who would be able to condemn the U.S.? This is the question.
This is a big question indeed. Now, what could be the repercussions of the U.S. attack on Iran for the broader Middle East, from your point of view?
Certainly, we are here talking about the Iranian retaliation scenario. So based on my estimation, Iran isn't going to target the US American bases in the Arab Gulf, which means it's a declaration of war with the US. And US says that it is fully prepared to the first point of military operations, and even when Iran is targeting the U.S. American bases throughout the 5 Arab countries, which means an aggression against all the Arab countries, as targeting the U.S. on the U.S. bases on the Arab soil, which means that the aggression of half of the Arab world, and many of the countries are very active players. Particularly, these countries have already improved their relations and ties with Iran voluntarily since 2021, and therefore Iran will lose too much if it targets the spaces in the Arab countries that would lose the Arabic ties, that they are the support Iran, and Iran is very much indeed for the Arab diplomacy, as Sultanate of Oman is a mediator, but Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and UAE are present in such mediations, particularly in the last hours of the U.S. strikes against Iran. So therefore Iran do not wish to lose the Arab ties that has been improved. Under my estimation, Iran, if it targeted to close the Hormuz Strait, would lose its ties with China, India and South Korea. That these countries are very much beneficiaries of the Hormuz Strait. Closure of such a strait won't damage the U.S. in any form, but would damage the Asian country that receive the fuel from the such an area. I mean China and India and the South Korea. So the rationalization for the Iran should have to punish you.
Ms. Omar, let me get to the point. And what do you think about the reaction from the international community towards what happened, particularly the United Nations? And what does this indicate about the current geopolitical landscape?
In fact, Iran won't pursue some sort of escalation in retaliation. It will be very limited towards Israel. As if Iran wished to expand, this escalation will be change the regional and the political landscape and the Asia. The issue if the escalation would lead to changes. So Iran is very eager not to expand the conflict and to be limited between Iran and Israel, because if it is expanded out of such a circle to targeting military bases outside of Israel or the Strait of Hormuz, that will lead the regional conflict or international, and the ultimate price will be paid by Iran, as Iran is receiving direct strikes following receiving the such strikes by its proxies. So Iran is alone in such a conflict. So therefore, Iran will pursue not to expand such a conflict, because it is not going to be in its interest particularly.
I was speaking about the reaction of the international community as well, but let me get to another important question, which is how will that development, or how will the developments so far reflect on the non-proliferation treaty and the race, the nuclear race in the region?
Absolutely. Israel was pursued to eliminate the Iranian nuclear program in order to be the sole nuclear power in the Middle East as announced. And the unannounced, there are many details. And of course, Pakistan is a nuclear state, but do not pose any threat against Israel. And certainly, Iran has a very historical opportunity not to take advantage of such an institute to go out of the NPT and to make such an escalation because of what affected its facilities, and should deal with the United Nations along with the IAEA instead of vows to revenge. It should cooperate with such an institution in order to take some sort of illegal form of condemnation against the U.S. strikes. Such condemnation resolution we should build upon in order to have some sort of collective security in the Middle East.
Well, that was Mr. Ihab Omar from Cairo, the journalist and researcher. We thank you so much for joining us on Qnews and for your insightful analysis here. And I guess now back to Mark Summers in our room, in our studios.
Thank you, Mona. Mona Masari there in our newsroom. Now, Iranians took to the streets voicing fury over overnight U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, vowing a firm and decisive response. Local people condemned Washington's move, with one resident warning the United States had endangered its own interests in the region. Another said the strikes had deeply shaken national pride and identity, promising retaliation. Iran, already engaged in retaliatory missile strikes on Israeli cities, denounced the U.S. strike as a grave violation of international law with everlasting consequences. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has expressed deep gratitude to United States President Donald Trump following U.S. airstrikes on Iran's 3 key nuclear facilities. Netanyahu has said the attacks on Fordo, Natanz and Isfahan were carried out in full coordination with Israel and the United States, continuing efforts by the Israeli occupation forces and Mossad to dismantle Iran's nuclear program, which he described as a direct threat to Israel's existence and global security. Netanyahu praised Trump as a fierce leader of the free world and a steadfast friend of Israel. He emphasized unity among Israelis and their resolve to prevail. The Israeli President Isaac Herzog has hailed the U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear sites as a historic victory for liberty and security, thanking President Trump and the United States, describing the moment as a decisive clash between the axis of terror and evil and the axis of hope. Herzog praised the action as a triumph of core values. Israel's Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, also took to social media to express his gratitude, invoking blessings for President Trump, the U.S. military, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli occupation forces. And Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich thanked God and U.S. President Donald Trump after the U.S. attacked Iranian nuclear facilities. Earlier today, Trump said he had obliterated Iran's main nuclear sites in strikes overnight, joining an Israeli assault in a major new escalation of the conflict in the Middle East as Tehran vowed to defend itself. Egypt's Foreign Minister Badr Abdel Ati has condemned the Israeli aggression against Iran, which began on June 13th, as a serious escalation that threatens regional stability. Speaking at an emergency meeting of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Istanbul, he emphasized the need to halt hostilities and return to diplomatic dialogue. Egypt supports efforts for a peaceful resolution and insists that military solutions are not viable for this crisis. Saudi Arabia has voiced great concern following U.S. airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites, urging all parties to exercise self-restraint and avoid further escalation. The Saudi Foreign Ministry reaffirmed its condemnation of violations against Iran's sovereignty and called on the international community to intensify efforts to find a political solution amid extremely sensitive conditions. The ministry stressed the urgent need to restore calm and resolve the crisis through diplomacy to pave the way for lasting security and stability in the Middle East. Qatar has expressed concern that the current regional tensions could lead to catastrophic consequences, both regionally and internationally. The Qatari Foreign Ministry lamented the deterioration following US airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites and emphasized the urgent need to halt military operations and return to diplomatic dialogue. Qatar called for all parties to exercise wisdom and restraint to avoid escalation, supporting peaceful efforts to resolve conflicts and promote stability. Oman has expressed deep concern and condemnation over the US airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites. In a statement from its foreign ministry, Oman denounced this illegal aggression and called for immediate and comprehensive de-escalation. The statement highlighted that US actions threaten to escalate the conflict and constitute a serious violation of international law and the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force and protects national sovereignty. Russia's foreign ministry has issued a strong condemnation of US airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites, calling the move a flagrant violation of international law and a dangerous step toward wider conflict in the Middle East. Moscow described the attack as an irresponsible decision that targeted the territory of a sovereign state and breached the UN Charter and Security Council resolutions. The ministry voiced particular concern that the strikes were carried out by a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Russia warned the strikes had significantly increased the risk of regional conflict spreading and urged an immediate end to hostilities. It called for renewed diplomatic efforts to de-escalate tensions and return the crisis to a political track. European Union leaders have called for urgent de-escalation and a return to diplomatic talks. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warned that Iran must never acquire the bomb, stressing that diplomacy is the only way forward. Now is the moment for Iran to engage in a credible diplomatic solution, she wrote on X. European Council President Antonio Costa echoed the call for restraint, expressing deep alarm over the situation and warning that civilians risk becoming the main victims of further escalation. He urged respect for international law and nuclear safety. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas reaffirmed that a nuclear-armed Iran would pose a global threat, adding that all sides must step back and re-engage in negotiations. She announced that EU foreign ministers will meet Monday to discuss the unfolding crisis. British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has called for calm following US military action targeting Iran's nuclear capabilities, reiterating the UK's long-standing position that Iran must not acquire a nuclear weapon. Starmer emphasised the need to de-escalate the situation, stabilise the region and get the parties back around the table for diplomatic talks. The Prime Minister confirmed the UK was not involved in the strike, but was notified in advance and is repositioning assets to protect British and Allied interests. He also reassured the British public that the government is engaging with international leaders to stabilise the region. Britain has said it was notified in advance of the US airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites, but did not participate in the operation. Trade Minister Jonathan Reynolds said the UK government had prepared for all eventualities throughout the week and reiterated that protecting British nationals and interests remained a priority. He stressed that the UK's preferred route was diplomacy, not military action.
That was a mistake. They should return to the negotiating table. Now focus now should be on de-escalation.
And that almost brings us to the end of our bulletin. Here's a recap of the main headlines this afternoon. President el-Sisi expresses Egypt's strong opposition to Israel's escalation against Iran. Trump says the attacks aimed at crippling Tehran's uranium enrichment capabilities. And Iran's foreign minister condemns the US bombing of Iranian nuclear sites. And that's our bulletin for this hour. Don't forget you can follow us 24 hours a day at Qnews EGY on our social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more updates here on Qnews.